that involves the last night of Jesus' life here on this earth, and some of the events that took place leading up to the crucifixion of Christ. We're studying from Matthew chapter 26. We begin looking at this passage this morning, and we're kind of focusing here on the Jewish trial, or the part of Jesus' trial that was Jewish in nature. Before he could ever be sent to the Romans for execution, he had to pass through the Jewish law or the Jewish court system. That, of course, was based upon the law of Moses. And as we're reading about here, there were some things that took place that were just undoubtedly opposed to justice itself. We talked about this morning, we're kind of continuing the same idea, but I talked about this morning a couple different points. I mentioned when we started out, really the first point was, the first stop was at Annas, who was kind of the former high priest, but in the Jewish eyes, the real high priest. And he tried to question Jesus and get him to kind of incriminate himself, but Jesus wouldn't say anything. And so because of that, he rushed him on to Caiaphas, who was the Roman-appointed high priest. And in the house of Caiaphas, you remember the story there, were already assembled the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and the Sanhedrin council. And so they were ready to put Jesus on trial the moment that he arrived there. In fact, we also studied about how they searched among the masses to find some people who would falsely testify against Jesus. There were a lot of people who came forward to testify falsely, but none of their witness agreed together. And so at the very last, Matthew records that there are two men who at least said the same thing, which was basically they'd heard Jesus say, "I am able to destroy this temple and then in 3 days build it back again." So that was kind of the stopping point. Well, I guess we talked about, a little bit about destroying and rebuilding the temple and what that would have meant to the Jews, which was basically a threat against their religion, against the law of Moses. Tonight we want to start with, in looking at this story, the response of Jesus Christ. And honestly, it's not going to be much different than that when he stood before Annas. There are some things that he does say, but only because the Jewish high priest made him say them, invoked divine oath upon him. But through a lot of the process of Christ being tried, what you'll find kind of reoccurring is Jesus is really just sitting back being silent. He's not saying much one way or the other. If he's finally pushed or provoked or made to answer, then he does so, and he does so in a way that, it's just basically straightforward and very simple to understand. But if you notice in Matthew chapter 26, you'll find again the response of Christ similar to that of Annas. In verse 62, it says, "The high priest arose and said unto him," they've already leveled these charges against him. He's already understood that he's going to be accused of something now. "The high priest arose, said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is that which these witness against thee?" But verse 63 tells us, "But Jesus held his peace." Well, we might stop and just think about the idea here. Why was Jesus silent through all these trials? Most of us, I would think, if we were put on trial and we were charged with something of which we know we were not guilty, and the penalty that was going to be coming upon us was capital punishment, I don't know about you, but I think I'd say something. I think I'd probably speak up, or I'd say, these guys, what they're saying is true. I did say that. I wasn't talking about the physical temple in Jerusalem. I was talking about my body being resurrected from the dead. But Jesus is silent through this entire process. And I think part of the reason that we would probably speak up, or maybe I should just say I would speak up, is because I would think in my mind that I can get them to see the truth. That I can appeal to logic and reason, and they're going to listen to that, and they're going to consider the evidence that's set down before them. But think about it from this perspective, too. If you knew that you were in a rigged court, and you were going to die no matter what you said, would you say much? I mean, Jesus couldn't really accomplish anything by saying something. What is he going to say that's going to change the mind of these men? Nothing. And there's no way that, it's just like a person, when you ever run into a person certainly not ourselves, but if you ever run into a person who's just dead set they're going to do something, and you can talk to them till you're blue in the face, and you know what? You're never going to change their mind, are you? Because they're just bent on doing it. And that was these men when it came to killing Jesus Christ. There was nothing that anybody was going to say or any evidence that could be shown that was going to change their mind. And so Jesus simply chooses not to say anything because, as we've just studied, whatever he would have said or could have said, undoubtedly they just would have twisted it to fit their narrative. So he simply chooses to remain silent. And I don't know, maybe even a little bit disgusted through the whole process. I mean, sometimes when somebody, approaches you and tries to talk to you or asks you a question when you know, or they know how things are and what's been said, you just kind of stare them bluntly in the face and you don't say anything. That may have been Christ at this point, but he certainly knew what was going on. Isaiah talked about the silent nature of Christ during this entire process. He prophesied of it in Isaiah chapter 53. In verse 7, when he spoke of the Messiah, he said there, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. Sheep, I don't know anything about sheep. I've never messed with them, never taken care of them, don't know any shepherds. So the only thing that I know about is what I've read. But if you read, what they tell you is when they take sheep to shear them, they'll go silent. They don't make a fuss about it. They don't fight. They just willingly go and allow the person to shear them and to take what rightfully belongs to them without any fight. And that was a prophecy that Isaiah talked about would apply to the nature of Christ. They took away justice from Christ. They took away his innocence from him, but yet he did not open his mouth. He didn't utter a word against them. And why did he not do that? Well, I think in part because he had already tried. He'd already tried to teach these men, but he knew it was futile. He knew there was nothing that he could say that he hadn't already said that might help them to change their mind. And, one of the lessons that you learn when you read through the Bible, especially the New Testament, and especially during the life of Jesus, is you can't teach a worldly-minded person spiritual lessons. And so that's the situation that Jesus was in. So he chose to remain silent. Well, if you look at verse 63, that irritates the high priest, and we're talking about Caiaphas at this particular point. And so he answers and says unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. The high priest, Caiaphas, knows that Jesus needs to say something. He's got to get him to talk. He's got to get him to say something in order to heighten the level of excitement and hostility toward him, even within the room itself and toward the audience that would have undoubtedly been gathered to hear this particular trial. But he invokes him in what's known in the Jewish law with a divine oath. In other words, under the law, the high priest could invoke somebody under a divine or solemn oath and say, by the name of the Lord, tell me, is this true or not? And they were obligated to respond because they were invoked in an oath with God's name. Christ recognizes that. He recognizes that authority. He recognizes that particular oath. But notice the question that he asked him. The question is, are you the Christ? Or we might even say, are you the Messiah? Because that's what they were talking about. Are you the Old Testament deliverer, the anointed one that God has chosen to set up as king and to rule over his kingdom forever? That's really the question that was being asked. Now, you might stop and consider, why would Caiaphas, of all the questions that he could ask, why was he so concerned or why was he so pointed with this particular question? I think the answer is, as you continue to read, and you read about the Roman trial and the process, they wanted to be able to charge Jesus with insurrection against the Roman government. And so if Jesus acknowledges that he's this Messiah, then that acknowledges that he's supposed to be a king and he's supposed to be ruling over a kingdom that lasts forever. Well, the only kingdom that was supposed to rule was supposed to be Rome at that particular time. And so if he could just get him to admit that, I think that Caiaphas felt we got some ground. We got something that we can charge him with. It's come out of his own mouth. And so we'll be able to go ahead and to move this on from the Jewish court system into the Roman court system. So that's the question. Are you the Davidic king, the the Messiah, the anointed one, who will rule over God's people forever. Well, Jesus' reply is obviously very short, very affirmative, but he also has some other things to say that we'll talk briefly about. In Matthew 26 and verse 64, Jesus said unto him, "Thou hast said." It's still amazing to me that Jesus never just comes out and says, "Yes, that's me," or "I am the Son of Man." But he uses a similar tactic that he used with Judas. I don't know if you can remember when we studied back to the disciples sitting around the table at the Last Supper, and Jesus is revealing to them, all you guys, or one of you guys is going to betray me. And one by one, the Bible says that they each begin to ask Christ, "Lord, is it I?" And remember what happens whenever Jesus comes to Judas? Judas leans in Matthew 26 and verse 25, and he says, "Master, is it I?" And Jesus doesn't just come out and say, "Yes, it's you." He said, "You've said it." And that's basically what he says as he stands before Pilate. Pilate says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" He said, "That's what you said." That's the words that came out of your mouth. We do that sometimes in our society. We do it in a way that basically reflects the responsibility back to the person who asked the question. Sometimes you can be talking to somebody about somebody or telling a story, and so they come up and they say, "You mean to tell me this is what happened?" And we say, "Well, you said it, not me." In other words, what you said is true, right? But I didn't say it. You didn't get it from me. And that's kind of Jesus here. He's not denying it in any way. He's saying, "You said it. You spoke the truth." But it's an indirect way of making an affirmation and not really placing the responsibility on him, but rather placing the responsibility on Caiaphas himself. So he used that technique with Judas. He also uses it with Caiaphas here. But he was in fact affirming what Caiaphas said. He was just doing it in a unique way. He also has something else to say about the future. Jesus goes on to say in the middle part of verse 64, he says, "Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." So Jesus basically tells him in the future, you're going to get to see who I am with your very own eyes. Now, what I want to stop just a moment here on and focus on, because Caiaphas is so enamored, and this basically ends in the eyes of the Jews, ends the trial. It basically convicts Christ by what he said here. But I want to concentrate on this statement, the Son of Man. That's kind of an interesting statement. When you go through the gospel accounts, you'll find it couple times in different books, but Mark really emphasizes it. And a lot of times when I read that, I thought, man, what is that all about? What is so important about Christ being the Son of Man? And obviously he's speaking about it, and people are picking up on it. And if you read this trial, Caiaphas immediately, when he says the Son of Man, it immediately rings a bell in his head. And what I think it ties back to is the Old Testament prophecy. I was thinking about it more and more in Daniel chapter 7 and verses 13 and 14. This was a messianic prophecy. This was a prophecy about the Christ, or the anointed one, that every faithful Jew would have been familiar with. But remember there that Daniel sees in a vision. He says, "I saw in a night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed." Who was it that came before God? Who was it that received this kingdom? Who was it that had all people, nations, and languages to serve him forever? It was the Son of Man. That was the vision that Daniel saw. And so when Jesus says, "Hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven," I think he's probably referring to this prophecy here in Daniel 7, 13 and 14. At any rate, if you read about it, that's exactly what Caiaphas and these other people who were trying to convict him were looking for. They've been waiting to hear something like that. So notice their reaction in verse 65. Jesus makes that statement, and then it says, "The high priest rent his clothes, saying, He has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now we have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, he is guilty of death. So as you get to the end of the trial of Christ through this Jewish court system, the actual charge that is laid to Christ is the charge of blasphemy. Now, blasphemy just means to speak in opposition of, or we might even think about it as speaking irreverently of someone or something. In this particular case, it has to be of God or of this prophecy here in Daniel 7:13 and 14. But as soon as Caiaphas hears Jesus makes that statement, he said he's guilty of blasphemy. We don't need any more witnesses. We don't need to hear any more testimony from anybody. And then he goes on to say, not only is he guilty of blasphemy, but his sentence is death. Now, I want you to think with me for just a few moments here. Go back to an Old Testament story here in Leviticus chapter 24. And it's important to understand this charge because under the law of Moses, and that's the law that Jesus was being tried at here, Jewish law, under the law of Moses, the charge of blasphemy, if you were found guilty of it, the punishment was capital punishment. It was you were supposed to be put to death. We read about a particular story there in Leviticus chapter 24, beginning in about verse 10, where it records this. It says, the son of an Israelitish woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel. And this son of the Israelitish woman and a man of Israel strove together in the camp. And the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord. Now, at first, you're walking around in Israel and understand this is pretty, you're getting pretty close from coming out of the promised land here. I doubt there were a lot of people walking around blaspheming the name of the Lord. But this particular fellow, he had an Israelite mother, but he had an Egyptian father. And so that Egyptian father probably had a lot of influence over him. And long story short, probably had a lot to do with him blaspheming the name of Jehovah. But the people didn't know what to do with him. And so they bring him to Moses. And Moses says, we're going to put him in prison until God tells us what we need to do. And so the Lord comes to Moses. And here's what he tells Moses directly in verse 13 there of Leviticus 24. He says, bring forth him that hath cursed without the camp, and let all that heard him lay their hands upon his head, and let all the congregation stone him. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, whosoever curseth his God shall bear his sin. And he that blasphemeth the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, as well as the stranger, as he that is born in the land. When he blasphemeth the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death. So why does Caiaphas immediately jump to the conclusion that Jesus should be put to death? The answer is because that's the punishment under the law of Moses for the charge of blasphemy. In their eyes, Jesus is taking away glory that belongs to God alone, and of course claiming it for himself. Jesus had, he put himself in God's shoes. He made himself to be God, and that was really what Caiaphas was asking. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? Are you divine? Are you deity? And when he acknowledges, yeah, I'm the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7, then immediately he says, well, that's blasphemy, and that carries with it the sentence of death. The problem, of course, with all those things is what these people weren't able to see is that Jesus was divine. The Bible tells us that he was indeed God in the flesh. He was divinity in a human body. And so they never could come to that conclusion, never could see that, even though it was very obvious and right before their eyes. Notice the reaction, though, after he is convicted of death. In verse 67 of Matthew 26, it says, then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? They had their charge, blasphemy. They had their death penalty that went along with the charge itself. And so with Jesus being officially declared a blasphemer and worthy of death, then that was their time to have their fun with. And the way that they did that was spitting in his face. That, of course, even today in our society, that's an act of disgrace or shame, isn't it? And then they slapped him with their palms. The Bible also says that they challenged him to predict who it was or to tell them who it was who had hit him. I don't know how many people were standing around Christ, but I imagine it was quite a few. And I imagine there were a lot of blows that were coming. You couldn't tell where they were coming from or who was throwing. But they were making fun of his divinity. They were making fun of the idea that, first of all, he was powerless. They could hit him. There was nothing that he could do if he was God in the flesh. And he couldn't tell them even who it was who had to hit him. So, the trial of Jesus, it's an interesting one. This is just the Jewish part of it. The Roman part is just as bad, as we're going to study about here in a few weeks. But again, I boil it down to what I said this morning. How do you apply a lesson like this? I don't know that there's a great way to apply it. But what I did point out, I didn't come up with anything new over the afternoon to impart unto you. But what I did take away from it as a Christian is, I just appreciate, when I study things like this, it's easy to say, well, Jesus, he endured injustice. But when you read about the actual things that he had to go through and endure, it's just amazing that a person would do that for us. And that's what Christ did. And the other side of it is this, a lot of people have to endure injustice, even in our world today. But Jesus had the ability to pull the plug at any moment. He could have brought it all to the end. He could have said, enough is enough. We don't have to do this. I don't want to do this. Not going to help me anyway. But he endured it for our cause. And so we could be saved because of what he was willing to endure for our sake. Think about that as we say our prayers this week, as we thank God for all the wonderful things that he's done, as we thank him for Christ and his willingness to endure the cross and all the shame that went along with it. Maybe there's